Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And still I rise, Mr. Speaker, and I rise saddened because I find myself on a mission of mercy. I rise to explain the circumstance that causes one Mr. Avalos, Jaime Avalos, to find himself separated from his wife and his baby in another country. Mr. Avalos came to this country some 27 years ago, and he was brought here by his mother. His mother was here to seek a better life for herself and her young baby. He came to this country as a child, and for 7 years, he was only in this country. He was being educated in this country. This was the home, in fact, the only home that he knew. His mother decided that she would marry a man that she met, and this man loved Mr. Avalos as a baby to the extent that he wanted to adopt him. The mother took Mr. Avalos, Jaime is his first name, took Jaime back to Mexico. She took him to Mexico for the purpose of registering his adoption. They were there for a brief period of time. And then they returned to the United States, where he, for some 20 years, educated himself here, went to a school in Houston, Texas, worked, stayed within the law. For all moral purposes, he is a citizen of this country. But lawfully, of course, he is not. Jaime met a woman, a beautiful lady, Yariana. He and Yariana are married. They now have a child, Noah. Noah celebrated his first birthday just recently. Yariana, wanting her husband to become a citizen, Jaime wanting to become a citizen because he has a child that is an American-born child and as a result a citizen. His wife is a citizen. He wanted to do that which would put him in good standing in this country, to come out of the shadows. He is a DACA recipient, so he had the privilege of staying, but he did not have a pathway to citizenship. Came at the age of 1, left at the age of 7 because his mother took him to Mexico to register his having been adopted, brought him back to this country. He meets Yariana. They're married, and they now have a 1-year-old child. They lawfully petitioned the consulate in Juarez, Mexico, for the opportunity to come in for the interview that allows a person with the standing of Jaime Avalos to ask for a visa, lawfully, living here as a DACA recipient, and only leaves because this is a part of the process of acquiring the visa. He goes to Juarez, Mexico, and at the consulate, they process him. And in the course of processing him, they discovered that he did come to Mexico at the age 7 with his mom. He has little to no recollection of this, but they discover it. And when they discover that he came to Mexico, left America with his mom, they then point out to him that there is a law that will not allow him to return to his one-year-old son, Noah, and to his wife. He is now banned from the United States of America for 10 years. Some things bear repeating. His wife is here. He is banned from the country for 10 years. Banned from his home, cannot return to his work, literally living in a country that he knows very little about. When he leaves the place that he is residing, he is always in the company of someone who can assist him. Understanding his circumstance, I decided to travel to Mexico to visit him, to Juarez. I did. I was there. I met with him. And I had an opportunity to have his wife and his child with us. And I saw him interact with his young son. It really does cause tears to well in one's eyes to see a baby grasping for his father and hugging his father and holding on to his father and loving his father, and the father reciprocating. It was a wonderful thing to see, but I was saddened upon looking at it because I knew that at some point we would leave. The wife would leave, the baby would leave, I would leave, and Mr. Avalos would be left in Mexico. The experience has caused me to conclude that I must do any and everything that I can to unite this family, reunite this family. This is unbelievable that we have a law that will not allow him to come back into the country merely because his mother took him out of this country as a DACA recipient, took him out of this country. He's a DACA recipient now. At the time she took him out of the country, took him out of this country to register him as having been adopted. A man loves him. He adopts him as a 7-year-old child. And this law will not allow him back into the country. There is something wrong when we have laws that will ban husbands from their wives and from their babies because they left the country, came back, always been law-abiding. There's something wrong. When we talk about comprehensive immigration reform, we don't talk about the Jaimes of the world. People who are entrapped in these arcane laws, these laws that only make sense to those who somehow conclude that if we can find any way to bar a person or ban a person from coming into the country, that's a great thing to do. I'm not one of those people. I don't want to see this happen to this man and this baby and this woman. We have a necessity to engage in comprehensive immigration reform, to engage in immigration reform that goes beyond the wall at the border. I am amenable to discussing walls at the border, but we have to go beyond walls. There are those who want to do more at the border. I understand. I'm amenable to having that conversation. But we also have to talk about the other aspects of comprehensive immigration reform that will include Jaime Avalos and the many others who find themselves in similar circumstances. It's a very painful thing to know that we have within our power to bring Jaime home or to allow him to come home, and yet we have not done it. You see, there's another aspect of this law that allows a person who has the circumstance that Jaime Avalos has to negotiate to be returned home on what's called humanitarian parole. This is where you make your appeal. You make your appeal and to our country. And you make your appeal and you explain that this is going to create a hardship. And our law allows for this appeal to be granted. It's discretionary, to be granted if we conclude that there would be a hardship by virtue of a person such as Mr. Avalos being separated from his wife and his baby. Well, it's intuitively obvious to even the most casual observer that there will be a hardship when a husband is separated from a wife and child and they've got a mortgage and he is a breadwinner for the family. Yes, there's a hardship. So we've made our appeal. And I'm making the appeal tonight because I want the world to know, and I want my record to show that I left no stone unturned when it comes to trying to get this family reunited. I'm making the appeal tonight, and I will be sending a letter to the Secretary of Homeland Security asking for the Secretary, by and through his good offices, to use his awesome power that has within it the discretion to grant Mr. Avalos, to grant Jaime the opportunity to return home to his wife and his baby. It's within the Secretary's discretion. Now, the Secretary doesn't handle all of these cases himself. There are people in the office who acquire the materials, review the cases, but I'm asking for the people who understand this and who know that this is not a case where a foreign power has one of our own and is refusing to release one of our own. This is not the case. He's not being held by a foreign power. This is not the case where if he is granted the right to return, he won't need transportation. He can get here. We're not looking at having to get him through harm's way with some form of transportation that would necessitate the federal government having to make an expenditure. This is not the case wherein if he comes to this country, returns home, where he will need assistance. He won't need food from the government. He won't need the shelter of the government. He won't need to be clothed by the government. He can provide his own food, clothing, and shelter, as well as his transportation. He but only has to be given a document that says he can return to the country that he has lived in for more than a quarter of a century. The country that he knows as home, where his wife resides, where his child lives, where he was living. He only needs a document that is within our discretion, our meaning our country, within our discretion to allow him to return to the life that he has known in this country for more than a quarter of a century. I believe that we can all, at some point, put ourselves in the shoes of another person. I just believe that if we just say to ourselves, what would we want if this were your son or your daughter. There are times when we ought to examine circumstances from a personal perspective. This is not a criminal. This is a law-abiding person who has a baby and a wife in this country. What would you want? What would you want for your son were the circumstances similar? Well, there'll be those who say, well, he came to this country illegally. Well, let's examine this. Did he really come, or was he brought to the country? He was approximately 1 year old. As a 1-year-old child, he had little to say, and I think most persons would agree, little to say about where his parents would take him. So he wasn't brought here by some third party, some person who was paid to bring him in. His mother brought him to this country. And there are those who would say, well, his mother was not right for bringing him. She broke the law. I thank God that I've not always been as blessed as I am today, because it inculcated in me a sense of caring, a belief, and an understanding that I haven't always had what I have now. And that, but for the grace of God, I wouldn't have what I have now. I'm not where I am because I'm so smart. Most of the people here are not here because they are so smart. Most of the people here because somewhere along life's way, they were afforded what we would call a break. It happens. So, but for the grace of God, I'm not sure I'd be here. But I thank God I was born in this country. I love this country. So I'm not a guy who puts the country down and doesn't salute the flag, won't sing the national anthem, doesn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. That's not me. But I do defend those who choose not to pledge allegiance, who choose not to sing the national anthem. I think that's what makes this country great. Every person has the right. Every person has the right to choose. I choose to do these things. But I also understand that I'm fortunate. I didn't control where I was born. And I understand that if my mother had been born on the other side of this border, this southern border, I just believe that my mother would do everything that she could to get to this country so that her young child could have opportunities and not be in fear of harm from various and sundry circumstances that are occurring across the border on the other side. So, but for the grace of God, it could be me or you or any of us. And I'm just thankful that I have been granted this sense of understanding the plight of others. I'm not a guy who says that we ought to open the borders and bring everybody that wants to come into the country. That's not me. I think that we ought to have comprehensive immigration reform so that we can make decisions about immigrants and migrants, people who simply want to come to work and people who want to come to make a life here. We ought to do this. This is what comprehensive immigration reform should be all about. Yes, we ought to talk about what's happening at the border. I'm not shying away from that. But I do believe that we ought to talk about some other things that are exceedingly important. I want to talk about what are we going to do with the Jaimes of the world. I think that we have to have comprehensive immigration reform because we need to know who's going in and out of the country. We ought to know who's coming into and going out of our country. I'm not one of the persons who believes that we just ought to have an open border. Come and go as you please. That's just not me. But look, I respect the opinions of those who do believe it. I just think that we ought to have comprehensive immigration reform so that we can establish standards, policies, procedures, methodologies, so that we can have all of the things that would make it acceptable for those who qualify to come and those who do not. Well, they can't make it this time if they don't. So I'm not an open borders guy, but I am a person who has great sympathy and empathy for people who are not as fortunate as I happen to be. And as a result, I'm making this appeal for Mr. Avalos, Jaime Avalos. I just think that we don't have to wait until we get comprehensive immigration reform to allow him to return to his wife and his baby. I don't think we have to wait. I believe we can do this under the discretion that is accorded the secretary under the law. I believe that comprehensive immigration reform is something that we ought to work on immediately, if not sooner. I think that we can see a need, but there are other needs that we don't see. They're not as visible. And Mr. Avalos happens to be one of the persons who is in that invisible zone. Won't be seen, won't be heard of, just suffer. We in this country think that families ought to stay together. We encourage families to stay together. Yet, we find ourselves now with a baby being separated from his father, while we have the authority to change it, knowing that he is not in the hands of a hostile power. He is in the hands of people in this country who, with the stroke of a pen, can make a difference in the life of a law-abiding person who stayed in this country for more than 2 decades, more than a quarter of a century, and left lawfully, but cannot lawfully return. Left lawfully because he went to the consulate that I visited, by the way, in Juarez, Mexico. People at the consulate are not proud of the decision that they had to make to tell him that he can't return to his baby and his child. They're not proud. They genuinely believe that this is something that is going to be reviewed, hopefully, and that maybe we'll get a different circumstance. I believe we can get a different circumstance. I just hope that it won't take us until we finally pass comprehensive immigration reform to have it occur. I am honored to speak on behalf of Mr. Avalos, and I pray that we can get a Christmas miracle, that he can come home for Christmas to his family. I'm begging, I'm pleading with the Department of Homeland Security and the Secretary to please let him come home to his family. Let him come home and spend this special time of the year with his baby and his wife. Please, let him come home. I've introduced legislation that can help those who find themselves similarly situated in the future, but that's not going to help him. The chances of our passing legislation between now and the end of the year are not good at all. Not good. And this has nothing to do with the mindset of a given person or personalities or the political philosophy of any given party. Nothing to do with that. It's just that at this point in time, very few things are going to pass this House. So this is not casting any aspersions, any sort of negativity toward any other persons. It's just the facts. But I do believe that this discretionary act can make a difference. I will talk to Mr. Avalos. I will talk to his wife. And I will talk to them within the next day or so. It's my hope, to those who may be listening and can speak to the Secretary, it's my hope, Mr. Secretary, and to those who are listening, that we can have this Christmas miracle, and that I can give them some good news, and I can say to them, he'll be home for Christmas.